President.
Thank you. Thanks to Bloomberg for having me. And good to be with you this afternoon at a moment in history when risk has gone regular. And I guess you don't have to be the personal attorney for Donald Trump or have the number of side hustles that Michael Cohen did to know that whether you are a lawyer, whether it's your clients, your firm, the challenges, the crises have gotten more regular, have gotten more ferocious. So this afternoon, briefly, I'd like to talk about some of the strategies, not only for responding. I tend to shy away from the term crisis response, because if you're responding, you're likely losing. While I was at the White House, we were confronted with two civil wars in Africa. Russia invaded Crimea. ISIS came on the scene, along with all the other issues in the world. And every time, we were reinventing the wheel. Every time in the midst of the crisis, I found myself trying to build the countermeasures that we should use rather than having something on the shelf that I could pull off. And civil wars in Africa, Russia meddling on its borders, extremist groups in the Middle East. These were vulnerabilities that we should have known about, that we should have been prepared to deal with. In fact, in the case of Russia, I watched as the bots started appearing on social media, online, the little green men popped up, and I found myself saying, why is it that we aren't dealing with this, and what could we do? I had started a process called counter-crisis management. It was really a theoretical exercise. It was designed to develop some of those tools that the government could have ready. And I said to my boss at the time, the Deputy National Security Advisor, I think we really ought to take this out for a spin. So we assembled a task force, the CIA, DOD's information operations, State Department folks, and we actually won the first battle in the modern information warfare. Unfortunately, we didn't keep up those efforts, and that's a longer story. But the folks at CNN profiled some of the efforts that we made, some of the successes that we had, and some of the reasons why this is not just a political issue. For those of you who don't work in politics, and I imagine many of you don't, this is coming to a theater near you. Russia is not only going to target political leaders, they're going to target Wall Street, they're going to target Silicon Valley, they're going to target Hollywood, because those are sources of Western power. So think about, for yourself, for your clients, for your company or your firm, what is it that's sitting in the back of your mind that's bothering you, knowing that email you sent, your colleague sent, that incident you had, that problem that keeps reoccurring? What is that risk? What is that vulnerability that you haven't addressed? What will you do when that vulnerability is exploited? What tools will you have ready? Perhaps more importantly, how will you know as it starts to become a problem? So just stepping back for a second to other issues, I put them into three buckets. You have the organizational issues. We can ask Oscar Munoz about some of those. I don't have to know where in his fleet he's going to have a problem of overbooking to know that 200 people sitting captive on a plane is a major vulnerability. What am I going to do when a plane is overbooked? When a crew member acts inappropriately? When a passenger acts inappropriately? Could be something as simple as a well-intentioned product that missed the mark. How about a technical failure? Galaxy Note 7. This is a product that was supposed to be next generation technology. I'm not a cell phone engineer, obviously, but I could have told you cell phone batteries, a major weakness. And I was actually in Dublin giving a talk on this topic, and somebody asked me, what would you have done if you were advising Samsung? I'll tell you later. Individuals' action. We are living, I mentioned at the outset, the age of regular risk. We are living in a time when an individual's action, whether it's an employee on the factory floor, whether it's an executive in the C-suite, whether it's a protester sitting outside of your offices, has more power than at any point ever. That sounds like Donald Trump. How about a spokesperson? I don't have to know what Jared was up to and the illegal behavior that he was conducting to know that having one person as the face of my company is a major vulnerability. If I'm advising the good folks behind Flo, I might suggest that I have a plan when she drives off the road and runs over some wildlife. How about your executives? Your executives who you know perhaps have a tendency to say things a little bit too honestly, perhaps a little bit too colorfully. I don't have to know that Travis is going to be in an Uber Black captured on film to have identified ahead of time this is a vulnerability. Doesn't even have to be something they said. Could be something they were allegedly saying. And oh, by the way, you're never off the clock. And then we get to the area of external risks, which seem to be multiplying by the day. The political, social, economic, security upheaval around the world. Movements that are penetrating organizations, ideologies. How about the penetration of cyber risks and security? And then the challenges. GDPR or GDPR is the next topic. Privacy, consumer expectations changing. And then we confront traditional crisis management, probably familiar to many of you. Batten down the hatches, let's weather the storm. The problem with that approach is that the speed, the scale, the sophistication of today's risks far outpaces that. On top of it, disruptive change is taking place amidst those crises. If your clients are not able to get out and engage, they are missing opportunities. They are not going to survive that crisis for long. And then we get to you. What are some of those risks that you're worried about? Perhaps something about malpractice, or just issues of your workplace, or maybe just issues with your clients. How are you tracking them? Many people say, oh, yeah, but I've got social listening, I've got media monitoring. By the time your firm, your client is mentioned on social media, it's too late. What's your early warning system? This is about applying that national security mindset for dealing with the challenges. It could range for something as simple as trying to develop indicators that monitor workplace issues, to something much more sophisticated. So this is my oversimplified version of the timeline of crises. And one of the benefits of sitting at the White House, working with folks from our intelligence agencies, is you get these insights into how crises emerge, what their trajectory is. And this is my unclassified version of what that looks like. There's an initial stage where problems are starting to percolate. This is the point at which many times you're advising your clients, wait and see. Or maybe your client is telling you, we'll wait and see. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, take away that you need to move up the timeline of crisis response. That initial stage is the point at which your client has the maximum amount of freedom of movement. Instead of sitting back or even just engaging in small and insignificant ways, you need to move your crisis engagement up and fully engage in that early stage, even as it starts to worsen. How do you get out there and engage with the issue rather than pulling back? I so often use in my classes on crisis management at Georgetown, the images that companies are portrayed as in the media during crisis. It's the exterior of your building. It's a black and white statement. How do you tell a more personal story? Crises are experienced emotionally. Go ask Oscar Munoz. So reaccommodating your passenger, while it may be legally sound, is not smart crisis response strategy. So the role of the countermeasure here comes in, and let's go back to the friendly skies, except this time let's pick on a different airline. The folks at Delta had a passenger named Adam Saleh. He and his friend were speaking Arabic. Some other passengers were uncomfortable. So the crew asked him to leave. And as he was leaving, he's videotaping this, and he had a rather large following on social media. Meanwhile, Delta, I'm sure with the approval of their legal counsel, said, we're looking into it. Viral video, bland statement. Which one do you think won? And I'm sure many of you are asking, well, what could they have done? I mean, they can't possibly know all of the facts. But they could understand, they could identify the risk. They could tell the story of who they are as a company, what their values are, the Diverse Delta campaign. It's ready, complete with graphics and videos and testimonials and ambassadors talking about the number of Muslim passengers that they take around the world to personal, professional events, the number of activities that they support in that field. And perhaps even we have little cards sitting on board the plane that in just such an instance we can use. That helps to tell the story. It helps to reinforce the messages that we're saying. Let's look at what they were investing in. All good causes, none of them, in this case, helpful. Another concept that I'll get to at the end of the presentation is the notion of infrastructure. In order to deploy a countermeasure, ideally you want to have infrastructure in place. Amplifiers, validators who are going to go out and tell that story. I don't know how many of you are hungry after lunch, but the folks at Chipotle had a bit of a problem with their supply chain. What should they have done? Again, not an expert in food safety, but I could have identified well ahead of time this was a likely problem that they would face. And a few months after it, I got a nice certificate in the mail that I got to take into my nearest Chipotle, and I could cash it in for a free burrito. That was a countermeasure. That was something you could have built ahead of time. It is simple. Yes, it'll cost you a little bit, but imagine if the day after the crisis or the week after the crisis, the stories of your customers, your faithful customers, is that they had a delicious, healthy burrito at Chipotle. That's a countermeasure. Let's go into outer space for a moment. Cell phone technology, as I was mentioning earlier, it's kind of like a lunar mission. Not every mission is going to succeed, but it doesn't take away from the very important goal of getting there. Imagine if you're Samsung. Imagine if you had a campaign ready. We are on a mission. We are going to get you the latest and greatest technology. Stay with us. We will solve the safety issues. We will be the company of the future. That is a very different story than Samsung, the company who blows up your phone. Let me go back to the White House for a second. One of the challenges your clients face in crisis is amplifying the negative narrative. If you're not ready, if they're not ready to tell a story, someone else will tell it for them. And it could even be well-meaning storytellers. In the case of Nigeria, 200 girls were kidnapped. And since I'd been shooed out of Europe and working on Russia, I applied my counter-crisis management approach to this particular challenge. I went into my boss's office again and I said, do we really think that as great as having 1 billion retweets of Bring Back Our Girls, that's going to solve this issue? Do we think that it is not, in fact, amplifying Boko Haram's narrative. They want to scare girls and parents from sending their daughters to school. How do we change this? How do you change the challenging narrative around some of your clients? It isn't by saying, as I often like to point out with Putin, he says the sky is purple, we say it's not. We're still talking about a purple sky. So we came up with Let Girls Learn. Others were out there talking about bringing back our girls. We got them to say, let girls learn. In the end, we got companies involved, we got countries involved, we had billions of dollars generated from this crisis towards supporting the 62 million schoolgirls, or girls that are trying to get to school. And it ended up being one of the more notable things that we did. Let me come back to that concept of infrastructure and leave you with an idea that perhaps is applicable to your work, your client's work. How many of you watched the royal wedding? Okay, the rest of you watched it, you're just not admitting it. So Patrick Jepson was chief of staff to Princess Di. He's one of our senior advisors. And he talks often of her forgivability. He says Princess Di was far from a perfect person. In fact, getting a divorce from the monarchy in the 1990s was a rather radical thing to do. And yet she had that authenticity, or the appearance of authenticity. Donald Trump also has the appearance of authenticity, and that's a different discussion that we can have. But Donald Trump, Princess Di, we actually wrote an article about this, they both have forgivability. Because Donald Trump came out and says, this is who I am. Companies have forgivability. Apple, after San Bernardino, came out and told the FBI, Rod Rosenstein probably didn't appreciate it, we're not going to cooperate with a terrorism investigation. And yet they're consumers. If you look at the value of Apple, it went up. Consumer confidence went up. They had forgivability. Samsung did not. They were ready with their countermeasures, with their infrastructure. So in the age of regular risk, how do you develop the solutions that you need to move your clients' responses up considerably? How do you help them generate those strategic reservoirs of goodwill? How do you create the indicators that give them an early warning that they should start to be ready? And then finally, when and where needed, how do you deploy a countermeasure that will help them not only survive, but thrive? Thank you.